going to go ahead and get started. Don't have anybody live on the Zoom right now, but I'm going to get going, and hopefully if people are going to join me, we'll just keep on going once they do. So I apologize for the couple of minutes delay at the beginning of the recording if you are watching this after the fact. Anyway, this is Political Science 1. This is class number 30585. My name is Paul Savoy. It is Thursday, the 30th day of April in the year 2020. And here's what we're going to be doing for the next 45 minutes or so. First of all, I'm going to go ahead and talk a little bit about the assignment that you are working on right now for this class, and that is due tonight, that is Thursday at 11:59 p.m., not counting, of course, the 3-day or 72-hour grace period that you have for all of our assignments in this class during the semester. And that, of course, is test number 2. So I'll go over the logistics, the instructions, the process for test number 2. And if anybody joins me on the broadcast, by the time I get done with that, I will go ahead and take any questions that anyone might have live regarding the test. And then I'll spend the rest of the time that I have available to me this afternoon talking a little bit, kind of giving you an overview of the information that we're going to get into over the next 3 weeks after we complete test number 2. So I'll talk a little bit about a couple of important questions, important things that I want you to think about over the next 3 weeks as you learn about each of the 3 main national government branches, starting with Congress, the folks who make national government laws, among other things, then the president, the executive branch, the folks who are ultimately responsible for enforcing national government laws, and finally the judicial branch, the courts, the folks who are ultimately responsible for interpreting national government laws, that is telling us what the laws actually mean. So I'll give you a couple of things to think about with regard to that, and then I will give you an overview of the notes for the U.S. Congress, which should be posted for you on our class Canvas page in the Congress module. So that's pretty much what we'll be doing and how we will do it today. So starting with the logistics of the test. Hopefully all of you have gotten started on the test, but just in case you haven't yet accessed the test is available by clicking on the assignments link in the left-hand corner of our main Canvas homepage for this class. Scroll down, click on assignments, and then scroll down the assignments page, click on the link table labeled, I can talk, test number 2, and it will take you right there. And what you will notice is that test number 2 is the exact same format as what we did with test number 1, the same 2 parts. Part 1, the short answer section, and there you will see a list of 22 terms, things that you have learned about since we took test number 1, because remember, none of the tests in this class are cumulative. So 22 terms taken from what you've learned about public opinion, mass media, interest groups, political parties, as well as campaigns and elections. Okay, so from those 22 terms that are listed there in part 1, choose your favorite 8 terms, choose the 8 terms that you feel you can do the best job answering, and then in about 3 to 4 complete sentences each, you are giving me a basic definition of that term, and you're also telling me why that term is significant, why it's important, how and why it matters for what we're talking about in this section of the course. So that is part 1, 8 terms, 3 to 4 sentences each, worth a maximum of 7.5 points each. So there are 60 points possible in part 1 of the test. Then part 2, the mini essay section, just like last time, I have 4 questions listed there for you. Pick the question that you think you can do the best job answering, and in about 5 paragraphs, a little bit more, a little bit less, depending on what you need to do to answer the question completely, give me your response. And your approximately 5-paragraph response to the question is worth the remaining 40 points possible for the test. Now remember, Two differences from when we took test number 1 back face-to-face towards the beginning of the semester. First difference is that this test, test number 2, is completely open book and open note. So as you're working on the test, if you haven't submitted it already, please feel free to have all your assigned reading out in front of you, all of your class notes from Canvas out in front of you. If you need to go back and look at information on any of the videos that you've previously watched, you can do that. Completely open book and open note. Consult whatever you need to consult in order to do the best job in answering part 1 and part 2 of the test. The other difference, of course, is that this time for part 2, you are not required to turn in an outline of your part 2 essay. That made sense. That was a good thing to do back when you were taking the test in class under a time limit. But since this is open book and open note, you're doing the test at home, there is no point at all for you to do an essay outline, so you don't need to hand one in to me along with the rest of your test. So remember, test number 2 is technically due this evening, tonight, Thursday at 11:59 p.m. But remember, for this assignment and for all of our assignments in this class, the 3-day or 72-hour grace period applies, meaning that you are able to take an additional 3 days to submit your test to me via Canvas, and you will receive, I will count it at full credit. In other words, I will not take any points off for lateness. Now, I know these are really crazy tough times, and I know a lot of you have a lot of things going on beyond, you know, your classes here at LBCC. So if you are in a position where you realize you're not going to be able to turn the test in on time, you're not even going to be able to turn the test in by the end of the 3-day grace period, please do send me an email or a Canvas message as soon as possible and let me know. And we can work out a solution that works for you. Because, you know, again, these are crazy times. And so I am trying to be as flexible as I can to be able to do everything possible so that you are able to complete the test and all the other assignments in this class successfully, so that you can complete the class successfully and move forward. Okay, so any questions now that I actually have a few folks that have joined me live, which I appreciate. Are there any questions about the logistics or the process dealing with test number 2? And you can unmute your mic and ask me a question, or if you'd rather don't want to unmute your mic, you can go ahead and write a question in the group chat, and I can deal with it in that way as well. So any questions about the actual process for test number 2? Anybody? Okay. Very good. So at this point, are there any questions about any of the content, about any of the information that is covered by test number 2? So, you know, obviously, you know, I'm not going to sit here and give you the answers to the questions or anything like that. But if there's a concept, something that's covered by the test that isn't quite making sense to you after the reading that you've done, after looking at the class notes, after looking at the videos, all that sort of thing, now would be a good time to ask, and I'll be happy to clarify any of the concepts for you. So any questions about any of the actual content information dealing with test number 2? You can either, you know, ask me, unmute your mic and ask, or put a question in the group chat. So any questions?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Go ahead.
For question 4 on the minute essay on the test, I was a little confused towards the end, or was it? Yeah, towards the end about that question. I'm a little confused on that.
Okay, can you be a little bit more specific? You mean at the very end? You mean the last sentence, the last couple of sentences? What are you referring to?
Might give candidate. Yeah, the technique. So, was a candidate that utilized them to win elections can be argued that such techniques are complementary with the average American attitudes.
Okay, so what? Okay, so what that's asking, it basically what it's, because the first part of the question, you're telling me what negative campaigning is all about, how it works, why candidates use it, that sort of thing. Now, the second part of the question is basically saying that most experts, a lot of political scientists have argued over the years that negative campaign messages don't usually work, that they don't really convince a lot of people to actually vote for the candidates that use them. But now what the question's asking is, can you kind of argue the opposite of that? Can you argue that actually having a candidate do nothing but tear down and trash talk their opponent, might that negative message actually be consistent with the way voters look at candidates and the way that voters make up their minds about how to vote? So in other words, what I'm asking there is, do you agree or disagree with the experts? Can you make a good argument to say that a lot of voters might actually listen to the negative campaign techniques and might actually help them decide who they're going to vote for? Does that make sense?
Oh, that's perfect. Thank you.
Okay, great. So any other questions about test number 2? Excuse me. Okay, good. So let's go ahead and move on. And if you just give me like 1 moment, I'm going to flip over to another page really quick. That's why I'm not looking directly at the camera right now. I want to go back and double check something on our Canvas page before we continue. So just give me 1 moment, take a 60-second mental vacation, and I will be back with you in a moment. Okay. Aha, okay. So take about an extra 60 seconds because I realized that Canvas messed up on something here and did not put up something that I wanted it to put up. So just hang on for 1 more minute. And I'm going to go ahead and add something to our Canvas page that should have been put up there already. And I apologize for the delay. Canvas is wonderful when it works, but sometimes it just doesn't. Okay. Okay, so it is thoroughly messed up. 1 more minute. So what I am actually doing is Canvas was supposed to have put up the notes for the assignment that you'll be working on for next week after you go ahead and take and turn in test number 2. So it was supposed to put up the class notes for the discussion of the U.S. Congress, and it didn't. So I'm just going ahead and doing that for you right now. Good. There we go. So let me come back here. Sorry about that. So since there are no more questions about the test, I want to do a couple of things. First thing I want to do is I want to go ahead and spend a few minutes kind of setting up what we're going to be talking about, what you're going to be learning about in this class over the next 3 weeks. So next week, the week after that, and the week after that, as we get closer and closer to the end of the spring semester. So what we're going to be talking about now that we are finishing up with our discussion, our seemingly endless discussion of linkage mechanisms, is we're going to be focusing our attention on taking an in-depth look at the 3 main branches, the 3 main sort of structural institutions of the US national government. So going into next week, we're going to be talking about the US Congress, the folks who, among other things, are responsible for making national government laws. Then the week after that, we're going to talk about the president and the rest of the executive branch, whose main job is to enforce national government laws once they're made. And then finally, the week after that, we're going to talk a little bit about the judicial branch, the federal court system, whose main job it is to interpret national government laws, to tell us what those laws actually mean. And so what I want to do right now is to give you a couple of things to think about, a couple of questions to keep in mind as you are learning about, first about Congress, then about the president, and then about the courts. And after I do that, I'll spend the rest of our time giving you a brief overview of the notes that I just put up onto Canvas for you. Sorry for the delay there. On Congress. And you'll need to be looking at those notes along with the assigned readings for Congress, as well as 2 crash course videos that will help you complete your next discussion forum post assignment that's due next Thursday, a week from today, that deals with the US Congress. So we'll talk a little bit about that. But for right now, I want to kind of set up what you're going to be learning about for the next 3 weeks, dealing with Congress, the president, and the courts. And to do that, I need you to think back to the earlier part of the semester, back when we were still face-to-face, we were still meeting in the T building twice a week. And remember early on when we were talking about the framers creating our current US Constitution back in the summer of 1787. And we said that, you know, in creating our current Constitution, the framers were trying to do a lot of things. They were trying to fix a lot of problems. But overall, they had 2 main priorities, 2 really big things that they were trying to accomplish in creating this new Constitution to replace our previous disastrous Constitution, the Articles of Confederation. And if you recall, and remember this was back before test number 1, we said that one of the main priorities of the framers in creating our current US Constitution is that they were trying to create a national government for the United States that was, on the one hand, strong enough to maintain order in society, but not so strong that it threatened the people's natural rights. So in other words, the framers didn't want to create a constitution that would take them back to what it was like when they were under British control before the revolution. They were 13 British colonies, because remember, the British national government was way too strong, way too powerful, was extraordinarily abusive, and took away the people's natural rights. So the framers said, we don't want to repeat that mistake. So we don't want the national government under this new constitution to be too strong, but we also want it to be strong enough. We don't want it to be too weak, because that was the problem they were currently living through under the Articles of Confederation, right? And remember, we said that this was a really challenging task for the framers, trying to create a national government that was both strong enough, but not too strong. Now, remember, we talked at the time about 2 different ways that the framers attempted to fulfill this objective of creating a national government strong enough, but not too strong. And the first method that they used was they put into the Constitution this thing called separation of powers. Remember that? And think back, we said that separation of powers is when the framers basically took the national government of the United States and broke it down into its 3 most basic functional parts, right? The legislative function, the power to make laws; the executive function, the power to enforce the laws; and the judicial function, the power to interpret the laws. So they took our national government, they broke it up into its 3 most basic pieces. And what they then did was they made sure that nobody within the structure of the national government had power or control over more than one of those 3 parts. So in other words, One group of folks in the national government, Congress, they got the legislative power. They got the power to make laws. A second group of folks, the executive branch led by the president, they got the executive function, the power to enforce the laws. And a third group of folks in the national government, the federal courts, they got the exclusive power to interpret the laws. And remember, we said what the purpose of separation of powers was all about. The framers believed, well, the framers hoped anyway, that by making sure that no one in the national government had control over more than one of these three basic types of power, they hoped that the national government would be able to be strong enough to do what it needed to do to maintain order in society from day to day, but would not become so strong that it would abuse people's freedoms, take away their natural rights, that sort of thing. So is that kind of ringing a bell for all of us right now? Does everybody have a basic idea of what we mean when we talk about separation of powers and why the framers felt that it was so important that they included in the Constitution? Are we good with that? I have a thumbs up from Jason. I appreciate that. So any questions? I got two thumbs up now, a real one and a virtual one, so that's even better. So is separation of powers good? Are we all good with that one? Yeah? Okay, now, back when we talked about this early in the semester, there was one element of separation of powers that we really didn't talk about much. I really didn't emphasize it with you back then because it really wasn't all that important for us back then. Thanks, Maria. Got a thumbs up there too. It didn't make all that much sense to talk about it back then, but it makes sense for us to talk about it now. Because as the framers were putting this separation of powers system into this new constitution that they were creating in 1787, they did so with one basic assumption in mind, because the framers believed that separation of powers would only work. It would only be effective if all three of the national government branches, that is Congress, the president, and the courts, all had about the same equal level of power and authority. So in other words, they believed that separation of powers would fail and the government would fail if one of the three national government branches became significantly more powerful than the other two. And if you think about it, that makes sense, right? If you want to make sure that no one in the national government has control over more than one of these three basic powers, you want to make sure that one of the branches has not become so powerful as opposed to the other two that it can steal powers from the other two, right? And so this was the biggest assumption that the framers were working with when they were actually creating Congress, the president, and the courts in Article 1, Article 2, and Article 3 of the US Constitution. They tried to design each of those three branches in such a way that they would all have the same roughly equal amount of power, that one branch wouldn't overpower the others. Now, is that also making sense to us? Any questions about that? Okay, great. So here's the thing. For most of our history in the United States, under our current Constitution, so from 1789 for a long time into the future, for most of our history, the three national government branches have been roughly equal in terms of their level of power and authority. So for a long time in our history, we haven't had one branch out of the three become overly powerful and dominate the other two. But guess what? That's exactly what's happening in the United States today. And this has been something that has been building in the United States for probably about the past 50 or 60 years or so. So today, in 2020, in the United States, one of the three national government branches is way more powerful than the other two. is pretty much dominant over what the national government does in the United States right now. Now, if I were to ask you, well, let me ask you, based on what you know, what you've observed of the national government today, which of the three branches do you believe is the most powerful, that dominates the other two? Any ideas? Who would it be? Which branch? Congress, the president, or the courts?
Congress?
Nope. As a matter of fact, if you ask most Americans today, they would say that Congress is probably the weakest and the least dangerous of the three national government branches. And we'll talk about why that is in a few minutes when I give you the overview of the Congress notes. So Congress is not a possibility. That gives us two branches left. Anybody else want to take a shot of this? Which of the three national government branches today is way more powerful than the other two?
President?
Yeah, you had a 50-50 chance there. Yeah, definitely. It's the president, right? And just so you know, this has not been the case just in the last 3 years. Because I know a lot of people would say, well, of course, the president is the most powerful today because of who's president right now, Donald Trump, right? Who really likes to throw his weight around as president and all that sort of thing. Well, that's true, right? But here's the thing. The president has been growing in power and authority for the past 50 or 60 years. So we've seen a growing imbalance of power amongst the three national government branches, really starting since the 1960s. And really the origins of that, as we'll see in a couple of weeks when we talk in detail about the presidency started to become more powerful and more dominant going all the way back to the 1930s, starting with President Franklin Delano Roosevelt. But starting in the 60s and 70s, that's when the presidency really began to grow in power and authority. And that the power of presidents has grown and grown and grown and grown to where we are today. As a matter of fact, when political scientists and journalists and others conduct public opinion surveys today, one of the questions that we like to ask Americans all the time is, which of the three national government branches, do you think is the most powerful, and how do you feel about that? And what a large majority of Americans will tell us consistently is that, yeah, the president's way more powerful than Congress or the courts. As a matter of fact, they would say the president is probably too powerful. The president probably has too much power. And they say that because of this, the president could be the most dangerous of the three national government branches. Okay. So this is weird, right? This kind of sets up an interesting question for us that we want to understand over the next several weeks. Because remember what I said a few minutes ago. The framers said, look, this new national government that we're creating isn't going to work. And this idea of separation of powers isn't going to work unless the three branches have the same equal level of power and authority. And the framers tried really hard to design Congress and design the presidency and design the courts in such a way that they would all have about the same level of power and authority, right? But that's not where we are now. Today, the president is truly large and in charge. Now, two questions that we want to understand over the next few weeks. The first question, how did that happen? How did we get from there to here? How did we get from a situation where the framers said, okay, all three branches are going to have the same level of power, and we're going to do everything we can to make sure that that happens, right? How did we get from there in 1787 to where we are today with this incredibly powerful presidency, what some historians and political scientists like to call the imperial presidency? And if you think about that word, if we call the presidency imperial, doesn't that kind of make it sound like the president is so powerful that they're powerful like a king or powerful like an emperor or something like that, right? How did we get from there, where the framers were, to here and this so-called imperial presidency? That's one major question that we're going to keep in mind. And we're going to answer that question next week when I give you an overview of the class notes for the presidency. So keep that question in the back of your mind. We'll come back to it next Thursday afternoon. But the other question that I want you to keep in mind over the next 3 weeks is this one. Because remember, the framers believed that if the three branches weren't equal, separation of powers couldn't survive, right? And the framers believed also that if separation of powers didn't survive, the government would collapse, right? And so if this were a cheap horror movie, and let's face it, life right now sometimes feels like a cheap horror movie, doesn't it? I swear. But if this really were a cheap horror movie and we could somehow dig up the framers and reanimate them, bring them back to life and have them take a look around at the political system, how would they react? They'd say, oh my God, what happened? Wait a minute. Why is the president so powerful? We didn't want that. That wasn't supposed to happen. This is dangerous. How is the country still surviving, right? The framers would be in a panic. They'd probably want to go back into the ground again and forget they saw anything. So the other question is this. If the framers believed so intently that all three branches had to be equal, how are we still in business in the United States? And kind of the secondary part of that question is this: can you make the argument that it is actually a good and necessary thing today for the president to be significantly more powerful than Congress or the courts? Can you make the argument that life in the world and life in the United States today is so different from what the framers themselves experienced when they designed the Constitution in 1787, that back then an overly powerful president didn't make sense, but now it does, right? Can you credibly make that argument? Okay, so those are the couple of main questions that I want you to keep rolling around in your mind over the next 3 weeks. And that second question in particular, do we actually need an overly powerful president today? That might actually, you never know, turn up as a possible mini essay question for test number 3. You never know, right? I'm tricky that way. So think about that, and we'll talk more about it over the next few weeks. So any questions then about those two big questions that we're going to be exploring as we talk about Congress and the president and the courts? Does that all make sense to us? Any questions about the questions? That sounds weird, but are we okay with this stuff?
We're good.
Okay, great. Okay, so last thing I want to do in about the last 10 minutes or so that we have left together today is I do want to go ahead and give you a brief overview. I want to call your attention to a couple important pieces of information for the notes that I just posted. Sorry about that. Sorry for the Canvas hiccup. But I just a few minutes ago posted for you the notes on Congress. So if you look on the modules page of our Canvas page, you'll see I opened up the Congress module. It wasn't there a half hour ago. It's there now. And in that module, there are these notes. Now, I will go ahead probably sometime tomorrow morning, since most of you are probably still working on your tests. Tomorrow morning, I will go in and I will add the 2 crash course videos on Congress that you need to watch into that module. And also tomorrow morning, I will go ahead and post the discussion forum assignment on Congress that's due 1 week from today, so next Thursday. But what I want to do right now is just call your attention to a couple of highlights in the Congress notes, because if you take a look at the Congress notes, there's lots of them, right? I give you a lot of information about the US Congress, and that's a good and a necessary thing. But I want to give you a couple of keys to understanding what is going on in these notes, okay? And so the first sort of highlight of the Congress notes that I want to talk with you about for a couple of minutes is the information contained in section 1, Roman numeral number 1 of the notes. Because remember how I said that well, let me mention the first part of point 1, and then we'll kind of go into it from there. So here's the thing. When the framers sat down to create the US Congress during the Philadelphia Convention, and by the way, as the framers were designing the Constitution, they dealt with Congress first. That's the first branch that they created. They write about Congress in Article 1 of the Constitution. And here's the thing. When the framers sat down in Philadelphia, they said, okay, what's Congress going to look like? What powers is it going to have? How is it going to be structured? How are members of Congress going to be selected? As the framers started going through and arguing over all those details about Congress, the framers were arguing with a very big assumption in mind. As it says at the top of your Congress notes, the framers assumed that Congress had the greatest potential to become the most powerful and the most dangerous of the 3 national government branches. So as I say there at the top of the notes, the framers were incredibly afraid of Congress going into this. The framers believed that if any part of the national government could grow too powerful and sort of spin out of control and abuse its power, it would be Congress, okay? Now, from our perspective in the year 2020, that sounds really weird, right? Because as I said a few minutes ago, if you ask most Americans today which national government branch is the most powerful and the most dangerous, they're not going to tell you Congress, right? Most everyone's going to say the president. And as I said, most Americans today, if you ask them about this in a public opinion survey or something like that, they'll tell you that, hey, you know, Congress, whatever. Congress is a big joke, right? Members of Congress, they're kind of corrupt, kind of stupid, kind of in it for themselves, but they're sure not dangerous. They're not a threat to American democracy or anything like that. Barely anyone today is afraid of Congress. So this brings up a really interesting question at the beginning of these notes. How did we get from there to here? How did we get from a place where the framers believed that Congress had the most potential to become the most powerful and dangerous branch in the national government to where we are today, where most of us see Congress as a big, weak joke, right? Well, the answer is really simple. How did we get from there to here? It was the framers' fault. And I explain what I mean by that in section 1 of your Congress notes, because in section 1, what it tells you is that the framers were so scared of Congress becoming too powerful and spinning out of control that as the framers created Congress in Article 1, they did so very carefully, very cautiously. They described in a lot of detail, in more detail than you see anywhere else in the Constitution. They described as specifically as they could what Congress could do and what Congress couldn't do. Because they wanted Congress to be strong enough to do its job, but not so strong that it could spin out of control, abuse its power, and take away the people's natural rights. And so as it says there in point 1 of the notes, the framers worked very carefully to try and box Congress in, to limit Congress's power to spin out of control. And guess what? That explains how we got from there to here. Why? Well, because here's the deal. In reality, truthfully, the framers were too effective. They did too good of a job in boxing Congress in. Instead of creating a Congress strong enough but not too strong, in reality, they made a Congress that is too weak, that probably doesn't have enough power to do its job effectively. That's how we got from there to here. Congress is perceived as being weak and ineffective today because the framers made it weak and ineffective, accidentally, unintentionally, but that's what they did. So does that make sense? Questions about that? Because that is the first really important thing that you need to know in order to make sense of what the US Congress is, what it does, and what its relationship is with the president and the federal courts. Okay? So any questions about that? Kind of how we got from there to here with Congress. Does that make sense to us right now? Okay, now, here's the thing. The framers, I don't know if they were completely sober when they created Congress because, they first of all, they made that mistake, right? They accidentally made Congress too weak. And honestly, yeah, everybody's got that image. I can see everybody kind of smiling and laughing right now. You can imagine, a George Washington staggering around or something like that, right? Kind of a fun picture. But another really interesting mistake that they made, I think, is that in addition to making Congress too weak to be effective, they gave Congress too much to do, right? Now, you might wonder, why are the notes on Congress so darn long? Well, because most of the notes, the last section of the notes, which is the biggest part, section 4, is a listing of the basic functions, the main jobs that the framers gave to Congress. And guess what? The framers overdid it. The framers gave Congress 6 different jobs to carry out on a regular basis. Okay? Now, here's the thing. Then and now, doesn't matter what time in our history we're talking about, that's too much. There is no way that members of Congress can carry out all 6 of their jobs equally well all of the time. It's impossible. They just can't do it. Even if members of Congress work 24/7, and guess what? We know they're not that energetic. But even if they were to be working 24/7, 365, they couldn't get all 6 of these jobs done equally well all of the time. Now you're thinking, well, that's fine. Who cares? Well, in section 2 of the Congress notes, what I tell you is this, that because members of Congress can't carry out all 6 of their jobs equally well all of the time, every member of Congress has to make a choice. Every member of Congress has to figure out their priorities. Of the 6 jobs that they're responsible for, which of those jobs do they want to spend most of their time and energy and effort carrying out? And which other of their jobs are they got to kind of push aside off into a corner and hope that nobody notices, right? So every member of Congress has to make that choice. They have to prioritize their time, right? They can't do everything well. So which of their functions do they emphasize and which ones do they de-emphasize? Now, this is an important key to understanding how and why members of Congress behave in the way that they do, right? Because if you read through section 2 of the Congress notes, what it tells you is that pretty much every member of Congress prioritizes their time in the same way. So the main message in part 2, and again, this is crucial into understanding how and why members of Congress behave in the way that they do. Pretty much all members of Congress enthusiastically carry out those jobs that they have that help them get reelected. And they push aside off into the corner those other jobs that either don't help them get reelected or that might actually harm their reelection chances. Remember earlier in the semester, back when we were still face-to-face, I talked about this thing called the reelection obsession, right? And I said the number one goal of pretty much every elected official in the United States, and certainly every member of Congress, is to get reelected, right? That they'll do everything that they can to keep their butts in office for as long as they can. And here is one of those areas where this reelection obsession incredibly impacts the behavior of members of Congress. And so when you go through the rest of the Congress notes, when you go through section 4 and you look at those 6 jobs that the framers gave to Congress, what you'll see is that 3 of those 6 jobs, and the first 3 in particular, are the ones that members of Congress spend most of their time worrying about, because these are the jobs that, if they carry them out, can help them get reelected again and again and again and again. The other 3 functions, though, the last 3 that I talk about in section 4, don't tend to help with reelection all that much. So members of Congress, they don't worry about them as much. And that's a problem. Because guess what? For the good of the country, for the good of we the people, Congress needs to be carrying out all 6 of those jobs all of the time. But they don't. They focus only on the first 3 because those are the ones that help them get reelected. So not a good thing for us as folks living in the United States. So does that make sense? Any questions, comments, reactions about any of those highlights, any of those keys to understanding what's going on in our Congress notes from Canvas? Anybody? All right, so I apologize for keeping you a few minutes over time. Let me just remind you once again, the official due date for test number 2 is tonight at 11:59 p.m. But also remember, you have that 3-day or 72-hour grace period tacked on as well. And again, if you're working on the test and you've got other stuff going on, and you know there's no way you're getting that test turned in even by the end of the grace period, send me a Canvas message, send me an email, tell me what's going on, and we'll work out a solution. Because I want you all to be successful on test number 2, because I want you all to be successful in this class as well, okay? So anything that you need from me in the meantime, always send me a Canvas message or an email. You can also join me Monday and Wednesday afternoons from 2:30 to 3:30 p.m. Pacific Daylight Time, my virtual student hours on Zoom. And if you want to do that, the link and the password for those virtual student hours can be found on the Canvas homepage for our class. If you scroll down past the picture to the section labeled Basic Course Information, the Zoom link and the password for the virtual student hours are there. So come and see me for anything that you think I might be able to help you with. And then we will meet again as a group next Thursday, 3 o'clock. I will deal with any questions that you have about the Congress discussion post that you'll be working on that's due next Thursday. And then I will preview the notes for the presidency. All right. So until next time, until I see you again, remember, we're going to get through this class successfully. We're going to get through life successfully right now. Why? Because you're not alone. We're all in this together. I'm here for you. I've got your back. Reach out to me for anything that you need. Take care, be safe, and I'll talk to you soon.
Thank you, Professor.
Bye, everybody. Thank you for coming. I appreciate it. Bye-bye.